Hello everyone, thank you for joining me for another video. I am going to be doing part 2 of the Jeffrey Dahmer case now. I've changed the lighting, I'm sorry. I've had new lights and on the last video they came across as being really bright, so I hope that this is okay. I don't know what's happened to my hair either. We're just gonna power through. So we are back with part 2 of the Jeffrey Dahmer case. Last time I filmed, we got through a lot. The video was long. I'm sorry. I hope that this one's going to be a little bit shorter. We don't have as much left to go through, though we do have quite a bit. I'm going to put another disclaimer before this video because there's still a lot to discuss. There's still a lot to discuss in regards to obviously murder, rape, child molestation, dismemberment, mutilation, all the disgusting and gory details. So in the last video I ended it just after Jeffrey had murdered Anthony Hughes. So I'm going to jump straight back in, and we are now in May of 1991. On the 27th of May 1991, just 3 days after the murder of Anthony Hughes, Jeffrey Dahmer approached 3 boys outside of a liquor store. Here he propositioned them with the prospect of money for nude photos. One boy was interested in the offer. 14-year-old Konorak Sinthasenphone, who was a Laotian immigrant. He felt he could use the money to help his family. So Konorak returned to Dahmer's apartment with him. Back at Jeffrey's apartment, they did take photos. Jeffrey then offered Konorak a drink which he had laced with sleeping pills. And when Konorak had been rendered unconscious, Jeffrey then sexually assaulted and abused him. We are wasting no time in jumping in with the very gory details because Konorak was another one of Jeffrey's victims that he submitted to his drilling technique that we spoke about in the last episode. Jeffrey would quite literally take a drill to the frontal lobe of his unconscious victims, drill approximately 3 inches into the brain, and he would then inject acid into that person's brain. The reason for doing this was because Jeffrey wanted to create a living zombie kind of a person, somebody that he had complete control over but was actually still a living being. Jeffrey's previous attempts using the drill had not worked, so he began to experiment with the concoction that he was using, and with Konorak he used a mixture of acid and water. He diluted the two together to hopefully not give the full effects of the acid. I don't know what he was trying to do. I don't know how, but this method worked, and Konorak, he woke up. He was obviously completely out of sorts. He complained to a headache to Jeffrey. Jeffrey assisted him in going to the toilet before they then returned back to the living room. Jeffrey assumed that he could leave Konorak, and as he'd run out of alcohol, decided he wanted to go and buy more alcohol, and so he left Konorak in the apartment by himself. Although he was dazed, confused and completely out of it, understandably, Konorak realised the danger that he was in and he made a break for it. He escaped. He made it onto the street. He was stumbling over, he was naked, and he was bleeding from his back passage when he was spotted by 17-year-old Nicole Childress and her cousin Sandra Smith. Nicole instantly knew something wasn't right here, and she returned to her aunt's apartment, her aunt Glenda Cleveland, who then ordered Nicole to call the police. Glenda had seen Conorak on multiple occasions around the neighbourhood. She knew that he was just a young boy, and that what she was witnessing wasn't just some drunk teenager. She knew something was seriously wrong. She noticed that he was bleeding from his head and that he was also bleeding from his back passage. The three returned to the street where they approached Conorak. Conorak clung to Nicole. She described this fear in his eyes that she'd never seen before. The poor boy was completely incoherent. Soon the fire department arrived. They got on scene before the police did. They placed a blanket around Conorak and waited for the police to arrive. Unfortunately, at this point, Jeffrey was on his way back from the store and he saw the three women and the firemen around. He didn't realise at that point that it was Conorak, so he approached them, and as he got closer realised that it was his victim. He grabbed Conorak by his arm, twisted it behind his back, began pulling him away from the girls. He was saying that Conorak was his 19-year-old partner, that the two had been drinking, that he was just drunk, they'd had an argument, and that he just needed to sleep it off. Nicole is having none of this. Her and Glenda know that this is a child. He's not an adult. He's a child. They've seen him around the neighbourhood with his friends. So Nicole's sort of grabbing at Conorak, telling Jeffrey, or demanding that Jeffrey let him go. And finally the police arrive. Jeffrey is saying to the police officers the same that he told the fire department. The firemen, they leave by this point because the police are on scene. So Jeffrey's saying that again Conorak's his 19-year-old lover, that they'd been drinking and they'd fought, blah blah blah. The three women are begging with the police, saying that, you know, he's a young boy, he's not a 19-year-old man at all, that they've seen him multiple times. The three women were begging the police to investigate this further, but we're in a time period where being gay was so frowned upon and so wrong that the police didn't want to get involved with it. They turned around to the women and told them to butt out, or else they'll end up locked in a cell for the night. And Jeffrey, because he was so cool and collected as he's been previously, the police believed him. They believed that Conorak was his 19-year-old lover. Whether they genuinely believed him or whether they just didn't want to investigate this because Jeffrey was obviously saying that they were partners, I don't know. The police officers then helped Jeffrey take Conorak back up to his apartment. In the apartment, Jeffrey showed them the nude pictures and was saying, look, you know, I told you, he's my boyfriend, blah, blah, blah. We were just taking photos, having fun. We got into a fight. Police did nothing. They didn't pull up Jeffrey's name. They didn't investigate the property further. In fact, if they had just looked into Jeffrey's room, they would have seen that Anthony Hughes's body was still on Jeffrey Dahmer's bedroom floor from when he'd murdered him 3 days previously. They just didn't do anything, and to this day it completely baffles me now how they could just accept what this man was saying and not listen to those women. It must have been not just to do with the fact that Jeffrey was gay, but also the fact that these were 3 black women. They were 2 white officers and they were threatening these women who were clearly concerned for this child. And it's got to boil down to race. That's all I can put it down to. They did not believe 3 black women over a white man. If they'd just taken 2 minutes to pull up Jeffrey's records, they would have seen that he'd been arrested multiple times, one of which was for sexually assaulting Conorac's brother. Later, Glenda called the police to get a follow-up on what had happened, and she ended up speaking to one of the officers that was on the scene at the time. The officer told Glenda that it was a lover's quarrel. They didn't even take Glenda's details down, but she continued to call them for weeks afterwards. Unfortunately for Conorac, back in Jeffrey's apartment, he'd just been escorted to his death. Back in Jeffrey's apartment, he again injected acid into Conorac's brain. This time it proved fatal, and just an hour after Conorac was returned to Jeffrey's apartment, he was now dead. Jeffrey began to dispose of both Conorac and Anthony Hughes the same night that Jeffrey had murdered Conorac, whether his meeting with the police had spooked him a little bit, the fact that they had been inside his apartment. So he decapitated Conorac, he kept his head in the freezer, and he placed the remains of Conorac and Anthony Hughes into the vat of acid after he'd finished dismembering the two. The two police officers that attended the scene, John Balkazak and Joseph Gabrish, they were recorded on the police line just hours after the incident, making homophobic and racial jokes about what they had witnessed. They were just making a laugh of what they'd saw to the 911 dispatcher. Later, the two men did get fired, and the Synthasenphone family actually filed a lawsuit against the state of Milwaukee for the negligence from the police that attended the scene. Milwaukee State actually settled out of court for $850,000, which no amount of money would ever bring back your child. Later, the two officers appealed their termination, and the judge, Robert J. Parins, actually ruled in their favour and reinstated their positions. Not only were they able to return to the police force, but they were also given back pay. Bearing in mind that it wasn't a few weeks that they were fired for, we're talking, I think it was like 2 years. They had all of that money back paid to them, and it was just kind of deemed that they really hadn't done anything wrong. It's just so blatantly obvious that it's a combination of homophobia and racism as to why the police believed a white male over 3 black women and a Laotian boy. Years later, Balkazak was also elected president of the Milwaukee Police Association, and it's just mind-boggling how they can just sit on the wrongdoing that these two men made and just completely forget about it. Not just forget about it, but to actually give somebody a presidential title within the police force. It's just unbelievable. And I don't care what anybody says, and maybe I'm being a little bit too outspoken here, but those two men are just as guilty for Conorac's murder as what Dahmer is, because they led him back to his death. Conorac, he could still be here now if they'd just done their due diligence and ran Jeffrey's name. And I'm getting angry about it because I'm still completely baffled how they let this happen, and I need to calm down because I get too involved in this bit and it really infuriates me. It really infuriates me. I'm gonna have a pretzel, it might make me feel better. Around this time, Jeffrey began to go on a complete and utter murdering spree. It was like it became such an impulse to him, such a drive to kill, that he was killing people on a weekly basis. The bodies began to pile up in his apartment, and at one point he was actually showering around bodies that he'd got in his bathtub that he'd murdered in such a quick succession of one another that he hadn't managed to get rid of their bodies yet. His neighbours also began to notice an odour emanating from his apartment, and they began reporting this to the building manager. The number of missing men was starting to rise significantly in Milwaukee, so he began to travel further afield to Chicago.
So in the process of editing this video, I've established that I've actually completely missed out one of the victims. I don't know how I've managed to do that, so I'm having to add it on now. On the 30th of June 1991, Jeffrey attended the Chicago Pride Parade, where he encountered 20-year-old Matt Turner at a bus stop. He persuaded him to go back to Milwaukee with him and offered to give Matt a photo shoot. Unfortunately for Matt, once he had arrived at Jeffrey's, he was given a drink that was laced with sleeping pills, where he then fell unconscious. Jeffrey then strangled him and began to dismember his body in the bathtub. He retained his head and internal organs, and he put those in his freezer. The internal organs were intended for later consumption. Jeffrey then went out and bought the largest drum that he could find, which was a 57-gallon drum. He intended to use this drum to dispose of the bodies in acid, with the assumption that he'd be able to fit multiple bodies inside at once. Unfortunately, the remains of Matt were then placed in this 57-gallon drum and disposed of that way.
On the 5th of July 1991, Jeffrey met 23-year-old Jeremiah Weinberger. He met Jeremiah at a gay bar in Chicago, and the two hit it off immediately. Jeremiah agreed to head back to Milwaukee with Jeffrey, where Jeffrey proposed that he stayed with him for the weekend. Jeremiah was last seen on the 6th of July on the Greyhound bus to Milwaukee with Jeffrey Dahmer. Soon after returning to Jeffrey's apartment, Jeffrey drugged Jeremiah. He used his drill technique on him, however. He adapted his methods, and instead of injecting acid into Jeremiah's brain, this time he injected boiling water instead. This did not work and actually put Jeremiah into a coma for 2 days before he finally succumbed to his injuries. Jeffrey went on to say that this murder in particular, he referred to it as exceptional. Jeremiah was Jeffrey's only victim to die whilst conscious. Because he was conscious, he had his eyes open. He quite literally slumped off Jeffrey's bed, his eyes wide in fear. Jeffrey then took several photos of his body where it was lying, and then again took more photos in various positions and stages of dismemberment. Dahmer then decapitated Jeremiah. He kept his body in his bathtub for a week before dismembering him and disposing of his body in the vat of acid. It was around this time that Jeffrey was fired from the Ambrosia chocolate factory, but this only gave Jeffrey more time to continue with his murder spree. On the 15th of July 1991, Jeffrey met 24-year-old bodybuilding enthusiast Oliver Joseph Lacey. Jeffrey convinced Oliver that he was a photographer and managed to lure him back to his apartment on the promise of a photo shoot. Back at Jeffrey's apartment, he offered Oliver a drink which was again laced with sleeping pills before he strangled him with a leather strap. He then performed sexual acts on Oliver's corpse before he decapitated him. His body was then skinned and dismembered before being placed into the vat of acid. Later, on Jeffrey's arrest, Oliver's head and heart were found in Jeffrey's fridge. He had planned to consume his heart in an attempt for a part of Oliver to always be with him. Jeffrey had kept Oliver's full skeleton. He intended to place this with his shrine that he was planning on building. This was recovered by police. Oliver was engaged at the time of his murder, and him and his fiancée had a 2-year-old daughter. On July the 19th, Jeffrey met 25-year-old Joseph Braidhoft. He'd just moved to Milwaukee and was looking for work. He was approached by Jeffrey, who offered him money for nude photographs. Needing the work and the money, Joseph agreed. Back at Jeffrey's apartment, the two engaged in sexual relations before Joseph drank the drugged alcohol that Jeffrey had gave him. Once unconscious, he was then strangled before Jeffrey decapitated him. His head and torso was then placed inside Jeffrey's fridge, and the rest of his remains were dissolved in the vat of acid. Back home in Minnesota, Joseph's wife filed a missing persons report. The two had 3 young children together. On July the 22nd, Jeffrey approached Tracy Edwards, where he offered him $100 in exchange for photos and to spend time together. Tracy accepted Jeffrey's offer, and when the two returned to Jeffrey's apartment, he immediately noticed the foul smell that emanated from the apartment. He also noticed several boxes of hydrochloric acid scattered around the apartment. When he questioned Jeffrey on why he had this, Jeffrey said he was using it to clean bricks with. Tracy then headed over to Jeffrey's fish tank. Jeffrey kept tropical fish. When he was looking at the fish, Jeffrey managed to snap a handcuff onto Tracy's wrist. Tracy then turned to Jeffrey, tried to pull away a little bit. Jeffrey tried to snap the cuff onto the other wrist, and Jeffrey then ordered Tracy to head to the bedroom with him. At this point, Tracy was beginning to panic a little bit. The smell was getting worse. As the two went to the bedroom, he noticed the vat of acid, and that appeared to be where the smell was coming from. Jeffrey ordered Tracy to sit on the bed, and he wanted to watch a film with Tracy. So Jeffrey headed over to the TV in the bedroom, where he began playing The Exorcist 3. Dahmer then pulled out a knife. At this point, Tracy really started to panic, but he had to try and remain cool on the exterior. So he attempted to appease Jeffrey, or to take his attentions away. He began to take his clothes off, and he said to Jeffrey that he'd allow him to take the photos still if he put the knife away. Jeffrey didn't respond to this. Instead, he turned to face the TV, where he began to rock backwards and forth and started to chant something under his breath. When Dahmer returned his attention to Tracy, he lay next to him on the bed. He rested his head against his chest and began to listen to his heartbeat. With the knife held close to Tracy's throat, he informed Tracy that when he eats his heart, Tracy would be a part of him forever. Tracy was now seriously panicking, but he knew that he had to get out of that apartment and had to do whatever he could to get out of that apartment alive. He began reassuring Jeffrey that he was compliant and that he was Jeffrey's friend. He insisted that the two went into the living room to watch TV because it smelt so bad in the bedroom. He asked Jeffrey if he could go to the toilet, and Jeffrey allowed him to. When Tracy stood up to go to the bathroom, Jeffrey also stood up, and at this point Tracy realised he had to make a break for it. So he punched Jeffrey square in the face and legged it to the door. he knocked Jeffrey off balance, so Tracy, running to the door, he managed to unbolt it and began to run down the corridor. Jeffrey was hot on his heels though, so Tracy didn't turn around, he just ran. It wasn't until Tracy had exited the apartment block that he realised Jeffrey wasn't following him anymore. Tracy turned down an alleyway where he noticed 2 police officers. He ran up to the officers and instead of telling them what happened, he was just begging that they took the handcuff off. The 2 officers, Robert Routh and Rolf Mudler, were confused by what they were witnessing. There was this shirtless man in front of them who was out of breath and had a handcuff dangling from one wrist. He wasn't telling them what was going on, but just demanding that they take the handcuff off him. Eventually they managed to talk him into taking them back to Jeffrey's apartment in the hopes of obtaining the handcuff key, because they noticed that their keys didn't fit the handcuff that he had on. On the way to Jeffrey's apartment, he was retelling everything that had happened to the police officers. He was saying that Jeffrey was crazy and that he didn't want to go back to the apartment. Understandably, you wouldn't want to, would you? The 2 officers approached the door of apartment 213. Dahmer answered the door. He admitted to handcuffing Tracy, but said that it was consensual. He told police officers that the handcuff key was in the bedside cabinet in his bedroom and motioned for them to follow him. Officer Mueller, he began to walk ahead of Jeffrey. When Jeffrey tried to get past him, he ordered Jeffrey to back off. In the bedroom, Officer Mueller noticed the large knife that Tracy had mentioned lying on the bedroom floor. He then began to walk over to the head of the bed where he noticed an open drawer. He thought that this would be where the handcuff key was. However, when he opened the drawer, what he actually found was the Polaroid pictures of Jeffrey's victims inside. He took a handful of the Polaroids, showed them to his colleague and said, "These are real." At this point, Jeffrey attempted to run. He got into a scuffle with the 2 officers before he was wrestled to the floor, and the 2 managed to call for backup. While on the floor, Jeffrey turned to the officers and said, "For what I did, I should be dead." The 2 officers then began to look around the apartment. They noticed multiple things that seemed out of place. It looked as though Jeffrey was beginning to prepare a meal, so Officer Mueller opened the fridge. There he was face to face with the decapitated head of a black man, his mouth slack and his eyes wide, staring back at him. As more police officers arrived on the scene, they began to dismantle what can only really be described as Jeffrey's personal museum of all of these poor victims that he had. There was criminal investigators, various detectives from the FBI, forensic analysts there. All of Jeffrey's neighbours were ordered to leave the apartment while the police conducted their search, and at this point, neighbours had no idea what was going on. In total, 4 severed heads were removed from Jeffrey's kitchen. 11 skulls scattered throughout the apartment, and 2 entire skeletons. Jeffrey had got a collection of blood drippings on a tray. Inside the fridge was 2 human hearts, along with various other body parts that had been wrapped in plastic bags, and to the naked eye would look nothing more than regular meat. An entire torso was found in the freezer, as well as multiple organs. A pair of preserved severed hands, 2 preserved penises, and a mummified scalp. The vat of acid inside Jeffrey's bedroom was a 57-gallon drum, which was found to house 3 dismembered and dissolving bodies inside. 74 Polaroid images were taken from the apartment, including every knife, every piece of cutlery, every tool that Jeffrey had used in his murders, including the drill, which still had blood on it. On the 23rd of July 1991, police began interrogating Jeffrey Lionel Dahmer. He waived his right to have a lawyer present, and instead he wished to tell all to the police. Over the next 2 weeks, Jeffrey admitted in detail to murdering 17 men between the years of 1978 and 1991. And clearly, as per this video, he went into graphic details about his victims' final moments and the processes he used of disposing of their bodies. He admitted to engaging in acts of necrophilia, as well as penetration of various bodily organs and animal bodies. He confessed to consuming the hearts, livers, biceps and thighs of multiple of his victims. He in detail discussed how he incorporated them into meals and used different herbs and spices and condiments and added them to meals. He drew a diagram of the altar/shrine that he was planning on building. He turned to the police officers and said if they'd have caught him literally just days later, his altar would have been complete. He said this altar was for himself, a place he could feel home and draw a sense of power from. During the trial, friends and family of his victims had the chance to address him directly in court. Jeffrey didn't look at any of them. He remained quiet and somewhat unfazed by what he was being charged with. This understandably angered a lot of his victims' families and friends. There's various footage available to see online of the trial. If you do want to go and see it, you can, because it's there. It was one of the first trials that was actually ever televised as well, so it gave people a real inside look into a case like this, which had never been seen before. Jeffrey was allowed to speak in court. He read from what I could only assume would be a written statement from his lawyer. He admitted everything that he did was wrong, but he still showed no sympathy or empathy to these disgusting crimes that he'd committed. He pled guilty to 17 murders through reason of insanity. However, when he was sentenced, he was sentenced as a sane man in February 1992. In total, he received 941 years in prison. For a year, Jeffrey was placed in solitary confinement at Columbia Correctional Institution through fears of his safety, and they weren't wrong, because in July 1994, an inmate intended to slash his throat. Surprisingly, he wasn't seriously hurt. On November the 28th, 1994, Jeffrey got up that morning and began his assigned work in the prison. He was cleaning the bathrooms with two other inmates, Jesse Anderson and Christopher Scarver, before the police officer that was watching them left the bathrooms, leaving them alone. Christopher Scarver took it upon himself to murder Jeffrey. He retrieved a barbell, which ironically was the weapon that he used to murder his first victim, Stephen Hicks. Christopher then repeatedly bludgeoned Jeffrey with the barbell. When the police officer returned, Christopher had already killed Jesse. However, Dahmer was lying lifeless on the floor, bludgeoned and beaten. However, he was still alive. Jeffrey was rushed to the hospital. However, he was pronounced dead just 1 hour later. When Christopher was questioned by police later, he said that God had told him to kill both Jesse and Jeffrey, and that the murders weren't planned. He went on to say that Jeffrey remained silent and didn't make a single noise when he was beating him with the barbell. He just lay there and took it. Jeffrey's parents remained loyal to him despite the truly disgusting crimes that he committed. Lionel and his stepmother repeatedly visited him in prison. Jeffrey later found faith in God and was christened in prison, to which Lionel and Sherry attended. His mother, Joyce, she had an outburst at an interviewer saying, not even saying, yelling, "Are you happy now? Is this what you wanted? Are you glad that he's dead?" And honestly, no, I'm not glad he's dead, Joyce, because he deserved to spend his entire life in prison, in a cell, surrounded by people who wanted to kill him. He deserved that. He got the easy way out. Him being murdered is the easy way out. He turned to Lionel during prison and said to him that he wanted to die and that he deserved death and he welcomed it, and Chris Scarver gave him exactly what he wanted and he got the easy way out. In November 1992, the Oxford apartment block was actually demolished in full, and the lot remains empty to this day. Nothing's ever been built on there. It's just a derelict area now. I understand why, because cases like this draw a lot of attention, and in the time between the apartment building being knocked down and Jeffrey being arrested, multiple people went to the apartment building to see where Jeffrey had committed all of these crimes. Dahmer's estate was awarded to the families of his victims. They decided it would be best to auction off his belongings. However, this sparked a huge debate and a group quickly formed to try and stop this from happening. This group grew so rapidly that they soon managed to raise around $400,000 in an attempt to purchase Jeffrey's entire estate, so that it didn't end up going to the wrong people. A further gift of $100,000 was donated by a Milwaukee real estate developer, Joseph Zilber, and so all of his possessions were then purchased by this group. This was everything: the 57-gallon drum that he dissolved multiple people's bodies in, the drill that he'd used, even the blood-stained mattress. Everything was purchased by this group of people. Everything was then destroyed before being buried in an undisclosed location, which personally I think was the best thing that could have happened, because that meant that the majority of his belongings wouldn't have ended up in the wrong hands or used for financial gain. Lionel went on to write a book. I haven't actually read this book. I've tried to get my hands on it, but it always seems to be really expensive, and I'm a tight arse, so I haven't bought it for that reason. But he went on to write this book, and his plan was a portion of the profits would be donated to the victims' families. However, the book didn't take off, possibly because 3 of the families actually sued Lionel. 2 for using their names without their permission, and a 3rd filed a wrongful death lawsuit against Lionel. And here we are in 2022, and Jeffrey's name remains just as big, if not bigger now than when he was arrested. There's multiple TV shows, movies, documentaries, books about everything that Jeffrey did. I don't think Jeffrey is ever really going to go away, and it's not him that we should be remembering. It's the victims that are no longer here because of him, all those innocent lives that he took in such a truly horrific way. Even someone like me who has known about Jeffrey Dahmer for years and has known about all of the disgusting things that he's done for years, this case still really gets to me. It truly is horrific, all of those things that he did. So it's not him that we should remember. It's those 17 men, it's their families, it's their friends that even years later are still tortured by what this guy did to them. What bothers me the most is that there were so many times he could have been caught. There were so many times he could have been arrested. And he wasn't. He wasn't until it was too late. He could have been stopped years before he killed that many people. The police department really failed. They failed to protect those men. They had so many chances to find all the things that this guy was doing. So many times it was right there, right in front of them, and he got away with it for so long. Just want to take a moment to say thank you for watching this video. I know it's a bad one. They're all bad. We're talking about murder, for God's sake. Of course it's going to be bad. I just feel that this case in particular is one of the most disturbing and sickening that we know about. I think because of how open Jeffrey was in discussing what he did to those men, we know so much of what they went through and what he did to them. So that's it. The 2-part video of Jeffrey Dahmer. Even though I said I wasn't ever going to do a video on Jeffrey Dahmer. If you've made it this far, thank you again. If you did enjoy this video, please consider giving me a subscribe and hitting that like button, because it really does help me out a lot. Thank you again for sitting with me and following me on this roller coaster of emotions. Thanks again, guys, and I will catch you in the next one. Bye.